Morning and welcome to the release of Section 27's new report titled Climate Change as a Human Rights Risk, a resource for health and education rights activists in South Africa. The report focuses on the impact of climate change on children's access to healthcare and basic education, and those two areas are our focus areas as an organization. The report also explores the current state of children's rights in the context of climate change and adaptation and mitigation efforts, and examines policies aimed at protecting children's rights in the changing climate. So I think by now we know that climate change is not just a term, an academic term, an issue of study elsewhere, but it's a very real issue affecting people in real time. An example of that is the devastating floods in KZN that happened in 2022. And then also, I think in 2 weeks ago or so, there were also more floods in north of Durban. And so climate change is really not an issue that we can ignore any longer or even debate and posture about. It's a very real issue affecting people, and unfortunately, the most marginalized people in real time. And I think that's why Section 27, in the work that we do, saw the importance of venturing into the space and also exploring how climate change intersects with our work. And we not only did this as an organization, but earlier in the year, we had a climate justice convening with other civil society organizations to try and establish the points of commonality about our work, and also how do we collaborate to advocate for this, to advocate for climate justice for the people that we serve. And so I think we have a couple of speakers today, not only from Section 27, but from our partner organizations in the sector, who are going to talk to us about the effect of climate change on health and education from their various fields of expertise. But we're going to start off with Motheo Brody, who's going to talk to us about this report, the research report that we're launching today. He's going to give us more detail about it. And after Motheo speaks, I will introduce speakers as they come. So we have 5 speakers today from different organizations, and but Mo will go first. So just to quickly read Motheo's brief bio, Motheo Brody is a candidate attorney at Section 27. He started off as Section 27 as a legal researcher in the Education Rights Program. Motheo represents Section 27 as a member of the Climate Justice Coalition. He's passionate about the pursuit of justice and socioeconomic rights, but his very hidden superpower is his love for people and his ability to invent fun wherever he is. So Mo, I think if you're ready to give your presentation.
Good morning. I don't know if everyone can see me and hear me. Hi, Pearl, can you see me?
Hi, Mo. Can everyone hear Mo? I don't know if it's my computer, but you're sounding a bit low on my end.
Oh, goodness.
Oh, there you are. Sounds much better.
Fine. Okay. Brilliant. Thanks, Pearl. Thanks for that lovely introduction as well. We're excited to finally be launching this research report titled Climate Change as a Human Rights Risk, which is a resource for health and education rights activists in South Africa. I thought I should perhaps just give a background and overview about Section 27, what we do and why we're doing this work for those maybe that aren't familiar with Section 27. So we are a public interest law center that is working towards the achievement of substantive equality and social justice in South Africa. And we are guided by the values and principles in the Constitution, and we use law through strategic litigation, advocacy, legal literacy, research, and community mobilization to advance socioeconomic rights. But particularly the rights that we work on are access to healthcare, the rights to access healthcare services, and the right to basic education. Part of the tools that we use, and I'm sure you'll hear from TD later, is budgeting. So conducting budget analysis to ensure that the budget is fit for purpose to realize socioeconomic rights. So from about 2020, recognizing that the rights to access to healthcare services and the rights to basic education are particularly threatened by the climate crisis, we have incrementally been working on environmental and climate justice as it intersects with the rights to access to healthcare services and basic education. And in that period, we've become members of the Climate Justice Coalition. We've made submissions, various submissions, for example, to the Presidential Climate Commission on the Just Energy Transition Partnership Investment Plan. We've made submissions to the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. Amongst others, the Climate Change Bill would be another example of a submission that we have made. And as Paul has alluded to earlier this year on the 28th and the 29th of February, we hosted a convening of organization in the sector. So this is really a continuation of that conversation. So convening of organizations in the sectors that we work in, many of whom we work with on various health and education matters, to really discuss climate change and its impact on the work that we do. And we had presentation and discussions from different people speaking to different topics. And part of that convening was really zoning in and discussing as organizations working on the sector what the urgent issues were in terms of climate justice and health and education that we want to collaborate on, and yeah, do some work on that to ensure that the sectors and the systems are protected. And I'm not sure if once you get the report, you'll see that much of those presentations and discussions are captured in the conference report, which is attached to this report that we're speaking to today. So about the report, really the report is about framing climate change as a human rights issue. It's the Special Rapporteur, Philip Alston, who noted that on climate change, that despite the extraordinarily short time period available in which to avoid catastrophic human rights consequences, it remains an optional add-on or niche issue, and most international rights organizations have not devoted urgent attention to it or made it an integral part of their mainstream work. So really this is a challenge to that, because I think, you know, as this report highlights, it really does pose the biggest threat really in threatening the gains that we have made with the two systems, but as we know, it affects all facets of life. So the report frames climate change as a human rights issue. It goes into the international and domestic law and what is set on those two levels, what the obligations of the state are in relation to climate change. It goes on to speak to the impact on vulnerable groups. I'll speak a little bit on that shortly. And then we also explore the required adaptation measures to protect these two systems. And then we also go into the climate financing and budgeting. So we speak to that as well in this report. To go into perhaps briefly on the different parts of the report. On the international law side, we speak to various UN special rapporteurs. We we explore we highlight what those UN special rapporteurs have said about states' obligations in relation to the protection of human rights. Examples of that would include the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which really highlights the obligation to address discrimination against women in the state parties' response to climate change by adopting specific laws, policies, mitigation, and adaptation strategies and budgets, among other measures. So on the international front, there's quite a lot that is useful to the work that we that we are doing, that we need to do. We also go into United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, but a key part of the report is that we speak to general comment number 26 on children's rights and the environment, with a special focus on climate change, which really delves into what the state's obligations are in relation to climate change and the rights of children. So GC26 is a key part of the report, and we want to use it quite prominently in the work that we do, because it's such an important document for us. So part of what it stipulates, it speaks to clarifying, rather requiring states to adopt a child rights-based approach to environmental protection. It also clarifies what that means, which is full consideration must be given to the impact of environmental harm, including climate change, on children's rights. And in so doing, sufficient consideration must be given to the multiple barriers faced by children in disadvantaged situations. And so, yeah, we delve quite deeply into that. The general comment also speaks to what state obligations are in relation to education, in relation to healthcare, and interestingly, future generations as well, the interests of future generations as well. We also go into South African law. We speak to the constitutional provisions that are relevant to this work. We speak to case law. There have been quite excellent work that's been done by people that are working, partners, colleagues that are working in the sector, such as the Center for Environmental Rights, which has done a lot of litigation, really developing Section 24 of the Constitution, the right to a healthy environment. And so, yeah, we lay out this legal framework that we rely on to advocate, litigate where necessary for the state to comply with its obligations. We also then go into impact of climate change on vulnerable groups and systems. Key amongst those, of course, is the grouping of children. When it comes to children, we know that from a health perspective, children are physiologically more vulnerable to the direct effects of climate change. And so we know that, children are, so it's the direct effects of climate change because of their physiological vulnerability. And we also know that children also vulnerable to psychological stress as a result of climate change. And so we explore that in the report. We speak to basic education as well, and the direct impacts of climate change on basic education, going into the damage to infrastructure due to extreme weather events. As I think, Pearl, you were mentioning a little earlier about the devastation that the 2021 KZN floods caused to the education system in KwaZulu-Natal. And even more recently, of course, there was those tornadoes, which is, I think, a new thing, at least for me, which devastated parts of KZN, floods in the Eastern Cape, and I believe the Western Cape as well. And among the infrastructure that was damaged was schools. I read a report that said about 60 schools had been damaged in the past 2 weeks from that extreme weather event. And so these extreme weather events are going to become more prominent as time goes on. We speak to that in relation to what the IPCC has said about what we are to expect in terms of climate change in the region. So it's a damage to education infrastructure, and we have quite dilapidated infrastructure in schools across the country, which are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, to the impact of climate change rather. And so part of what we speak about there is in the report is the fact that fixing schools, complying with the norms and standards already as a start, creates more resilient infrastructure, school infrastructure. So that's school infrastructure. We speak also to the reduced educational attainment due to excessive heat. There are studies which we highlight in the report that speaks to the dramatic reduced educational performance of learners who are studying under in hot classrooms, in hot temperatures, compared to learners, for example, who are learning in cooler temperatures. So that's children, health, and education. We continue to speak about other vulnerable groups, women, migrants, persons living with disabilities, and what their vulnerability is specifically. And then we go into some of the adaptive measures that we think are crucial, looking at the research that's available. From a health perspective, we were aware that there was a National Climate Change and Health Adaptation Plan, which was published in 2014, and it set out various things and the plan was supposed to be implemented between 2014 and 2019. And just under 2 million rand was allocated to this plan. And what this plan said, it identified various health and environment risk areas. It proposed conducting a national vulnerability assessment. It proposed strengthening and reviewing of monitoring and surveillance systems. But we have no information about what has happened with that plan. Was it implemented? How the money was spent? Despite there being a plan, right? And it ran between 2014 and 2019, and there's nothing that we have certainly come across in terms of an update on that plan. So that's adaptation health in the South African context, but we also look at a framework that has been published by the World Health Organization for building climate resilient health systems, which we unpack in the report, and it lists about 10 different points that must be addressed to ensure that the health system is more resilient to climate change. That includes training of the health workforce, doing vulnerability, capacity, and adaptation assessments, health and climate research. So there's quite a number of points that must be that the framework proposes must be addressed to ensure that the system is more resilient. And then with regards to education, already made the speaking to adaptation, spoke to the fact that we still have a huge backlog of schools which are dilapidated. The norms and standards have still not been fully complied with. And really that's the first step to ensuring that our system, our infrastructure can withstand the impact of climate change or the extreme weather events. And then we also speak to the heat aspect and provide proposals around dealing with the issue of heat, which is a big issue, and it's going to increasingly become a big issue. There's research that suggests that making use of air conditioning units improves learning outcomes, looking at providing cold water at intervals, so things that could be done at a school level, planting of trees, the creation of cool rooms for use by learners to cool down on extremely hot days. So, Pearl, without taking too much time, I think I can pause there about what the report basically speaks to. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. I think you're muted, Pearl.
Oh man, thank you so much. I was saying you did okay with time. Thank you very much for that presentation. And I think what I enjoyed a lot as well, and also in the report, is just simplifying what adaptation looks like and how, at school level, at health facility levels, what are some of the implementable things or some things that people can do to mitigate the effects of climate change. So that's really, I think that's a good part or a great part of the report. So thank you for that, Motheo. And on to our next speaker, I think one thing that I didn't mention in the beginning is if you have questions at any point when a speaker is speaking, please use the chat functions. Please do ask questions for speakers. And also one thing that you can do is also just let us know who's in the room. What's your name, your surname, and which organization are you from? It's always good to know who we're interacting with. It's always good to know, to network as well. So that's also something that you can do in the chat functions. So thank you very much to our first speaker, Motheo. And so I'm going to move on to our next speaker, Matshidiso Lengwasa from Section 27 as well, who's going to speak to us a little about climate financing. And so plans and policies just remain that unless adequate funding is allocated to them for their implementation. And at Section 27, we're fortunate to have somebody who's very passionate about using the budget as a tool to attain socioeconomic rights and justice. And so I'm just going to quickly introduce Matshidiso for those who are not familiar with her or the work that she does. Matshidiso Lengwasa is a budget researcher at Section 27 and the chairperson of the Budget Justice Coalition. She's passionate about using fiscal policy to promote equality and social justice. Tsidi's interest in social development stems from her experience in eMalahleni, where mining activities negatively impacted her community. Before joining Section 27, Tsidi earned a master's degree in international development and education from the University of Sussex and a Bachelor of Commerce in Accounting Sciences from Wits University. She brings experience from governance and education, tech, and policy sectors to her work. So thank you very much. Welcome to Tsidi. Tsidi never lets us forget that she is from eMalahleni, representing Mpumalanga. And so I would be terribly amiss not mention that fact. But Tsidi, if you're ready, please do take it away.
Thanks, Pearl. Thank you very much for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. Apologies, I don't have like earphones in, so you might hear a hadida or something. I'm in Johannesburg. That's how we live here. But yeah, I'm very excited to be on this panel and to really talk about this report because, as Pearl says, like I'm very passionate about this, specifically because of a few things. I think firstly, like just my upbringing in Witbank and seeing eMalahleni and like the coal belt and just seeing how, you know, like just seeing the inequitable distribution of resources and how, yes, there's been a lot of money that's been made in areas like that through the coal that we export to the world, but the lived reality of most people in those coal communities and those carbon intensive communities have not really realized those benefits as much. Instead, a lot of the human rights are actually violated, like the right to access quality healthcare services, your environmental rights, right to basic nutrition, a lot of those things. And so when there's a conversation about like climate change and the just energy transition, on the one hand, you know, there's a lot of anxiety, especially in the area. I think I'll try and speak on behalf of it, but to say that I've noticed like a lot of anxiety because there's a concern that, you know, everyone knows in the area about like the impact of climate change, or well, of coal, of like carbon emissions on our lived experience or like the quality of our life. But there's still a fear that if this transition is done in a way that doesn't actually foreground the perspectives and the experiences of people, there could be it could be a situation where they're even further disenfranchised. And I think that extends not just, you know, in the coal, in the carbon intensive communities, but also, or the carbon or the coal mining communities, but also just in general, you know, as a country, as a continent, and just globally, that you know, the climate change and the climate crisis impacts everyone and will continue to, as an ongoing crisis that has affected us all and will continue to do so. We know, you know, when we talk about like weather, but we're noticing increasing frequency of extreme weather events. However, as the report details, which is like something that I think it's just so important, is just knowing that while this affects everyone, like other social crises, there's a disproportionate or uneven sharing of the burden. And it just so happens to be that the people who are least involved in the process of emissions and, you know, that side and the decisions behind that are the ones who bear you know, bear the cost of it. And so it's just really important for climate financing, but also just like policy decisions, and also our activism and the work that we do to recognize this, that, you know, there are people who are affected by this, and the marginalized groups are the ones who tend to be most affected by any social crisis, including this one. So I know also that right now, I mean, right now there's a lot of, it's more of a political contestation. I know like today is the inauguration, and people and the media have been reflecting on the politics, and again, you know, very little or sparse. I mean, you can correct me, maybe I haven't come across enough of it, but not a lot of reflection about this ongoing crisis or like climate change, you know, also as a political issue. And it just seems like almost like a side topic towards the end, even though as a country we are involved in the just energy transition, and there's a lot of money, a lot of debts, a lot of and it is like quite a long read, but I think that it's very important because when the opportunity comes, when the time comes where the climate change bill is being discussed, or mitigation and adaptation methods are being proposed by either the state, and by stakeholders, including the private sector, international finance institutions, all the different stakeholders, including us as civil society and everyday people, community organizations, that when we have these conversations about climate change, we have this one resource that adequately, that like really goes into detail and informs and empowers us with the knowledge to understand and the evidence of how climate change, the ongoing crisis and how it plays out, and the impacts of that on human rights. And so one of the most powerful ways to ensure that we actually do have both a just transition, but also that we respond effectively to the crisis that we're in. So, the climate change is a crisis, it's ongoing. I think both Pearl and Motheo have spoken about the 2022 floods in KZN, but we see this, increasing frequency of that. If it's not the floods, then it's droughts in some areas, there are heat waves, and they all have implications on human rights. And in this crisis, it's very difficult to remain optimistic or think that there's a way out of it, especially because much of the crisis, like a lot of this is man-made, and it would require huge transformation or a different way of thinking in order to do that, which is quite a challenge. But I think having a report like this can also illustrate what work has been done and what work can be done, and can just foreground some of our interventions through human rights, and realize that we can all participate in the conversation about climate change because it affects everyone. So yeah, in this ongoing real crisis, I believe that there's an opportunity to build back better and to create a society, both in South Africa, but a global society that is not, that doesn't overlook human rights or put it as an afterthought, but that actually foregrounds the human rights and the rights of all people, especially the more marginalized people in the community, or in the various communities. And we can do that. We can create a society that's not foreground, where inequality is not the norm, but rather that we're thinking proactively about that. And it's also, I think also the word for the transition, the just energy transition, is that while there is anxiety or conversation about it, there are issues that I think civil society has about, civil society organizations have raised about transparency, or that we actually don't know what's going on with the deal yet, and it doesn't feel as participatory. But I think that could be done better with improved ways of policy making that foregrounds participation, and that creates that we promote policies and a climate change response that actually reflects on the lived experiences of people, and it's not something that's imposed on people. Really a transition that's actually just and that's fair. And in order to achieve that, I think there's also which is why I come into the conversation, is to look at the tools that we have in our box to actually achieve that. And one of the most powerful tools to achieving things is with fiscal policy and how we fund these policies. Because I think, again, Pearl had said that we can, and we're seeing it also with elections or whatever it is that it's very easy to say things, especially, to say education, access to free, quality, basic education for all, healthcare services for all, basic nutrition. But a lot of the criticisms that people have is that while one thing is being said, the implementation part is quite in the country. We have really good policy documents, could always be better, but we have good policy documents, but then when we implement them, there is something missing. And money, or how we resource the implementation of these policies, is a make or break in actually realizing these rights. Because it's one thing to say, oh, we are governed by the Constitution and we have to do this in terms of provide this right. But when we impose or we don't foreground the experiences of people, everyday people, in shaping this policy or in these adaptation and mitigation interventions, suggest I don't really want to spend too much time talking at the expense of an constructive conversation about this, because I've just seen in the chats like the various organizations that people are representing, and it's just really great to have civil society in the space and not just once off, but to just continually work together in this, because we're all affected and we all do work that is affected by this crisis. And yeah, we should also be thinking about how do we finance this. So the report, I'll just like wrap up to say, like, in the financing of the reports, a big part of it, if there's any takeaways from a financial perspective, is what alternatives that we propose to better positioning our country and our societies, our communities, to be ready for or to adapt and to mitigate the impacts, but also adapt and create a society that's like better for the next generations. And the ways to do that from a finance perspective is firstly to inculcate climate responsive budgeting. So right now the status quo is definitely climate change will be mentioned maybe once, maybe twice in the budget documents if we're lucky, but it's still like, while there's so much conversation about it, that intersection between how we allocate resources as a country to health, to human rights, and how we respond to climate change hasn't meshed well together yet. And so one of the ways to achieve that or to bridge that gap is with budgeting that's responsive to climate change, to the adaptation and mitigation needs, especially of those who are marginalized. And another way to do that is to enact participatory human rights impact assessments, which is quite a lot of words, but to say that whenever budget decisions are being made or policies are being pursued or whatever it is, that we foreground human rights and always consider what impact does this have on this marginalized community. And it's not just what we necessarily think the impact is going to be, but it should be participatory and it should be foregrounded in what the people who are most going to experience this policy, how they engage or interact with those systems and that policy. And then of course that is a good segue into the children's rights impact assessments, which Matteo has mentioned about. I think the UN endorses them, and we also go into that in this report, which, you know, that's something that you can look to foreground some of your understanding of that. But it's just really important because children are, like, you know, are so marginalized in our communities, and are even more marginalized because of their position as, you know, not their children, and so they're more vulnerable to certain some of these impacts, and they have no participation in how do we shape our responses. So we have a double responsibility to not just look at reactions and like the political economy of today, but to also think about the decisions that we make, the loans that we're taking in foreign currency or whatever it is. What impact does that have for the next generation, the children of today? Will they be living in a society where maybe we have transitioned, but the burden of that debt is disproportionately borne by the most marginalized of those children? Will they be living in an equal society, or we're just accepting the norm of inequality in our country? And yeah, so that's the third one. And then the last one is gender responsive budgeting, which I think National Treasury is on their way to implementing, but it's an important way to protect women, particularly marginalized women, and recognize the impact of climate change on the informal economy, the unpaid care work, and just the the possibility of it entrenching the gender and the unequal gender and social norms in this country. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say, and especially with regards to the report, because I think that it's a really good opportunity for civil society to just work together and have like a really coherent and strong voice in and providing advocacy and recommendations that are going to stand the test of time, and that the next generation of people will be looking back and say, you know what, we like that, we can learn from that. So yeah, I'll just close off with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matshidiso from Emalahleri. You've given us so much, and one of the things that you mentioned is that equality should be a norm, and I think that all of us really should reflect or learn a lot about the financing aspect of climate justice, you know, and to explore different financial models and avenues, particularly international funding, so that we make, you know, decisions that will ensure that equality is indeed a norm. So thank you very much. If you've got questions around climate financing, if you're not sure what it is or how you or your organization could pursue it, drop a question in the comments. If not, you could wait to the end where we'll have a Q&A sessions. You could just, you know, note your questions on the side. But thank you very much, Matshidiso, for that presentation on climate financing. And I'm just going to move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Tatiana Kazim from EELC Equal Education Law Center. Tatiana is a senior legal researcher at EELC and is responsible for managing the research team. Her research encompasses both education and early childhood development. She sits on the steering committee of the Real Reform for ECD campaign and chairs the legal subcommittee. Tatiana is currently studying for a PhD at Stellenbosch University. The doctoral studies focus on the obligations of private actors in relation to socio-economic rights. So Tatiana, if you're ready for us, you know, to give us your reflections on the report, particularly, you know, from the perspective of education, and also some work that EELC has also done in the space of climate justice.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Pearl mentioned, I do lead the Equal Education Law Centre's research team, and today I'm presenting on behalf of one of our brilliant researchers, Catherine Sutherland. So building on the Law Centre's existing expertise in basic education, early childhood development, and infrastructure law in particular, Catherine took the lead in launching our climate justice work at the beginning of last year. So let me start by saying that I completely agree with Matteo's introductory remarks. Climate justice is a human rights issue. The state already has clear duties to ensure that everyone, particularly children, are protected from climate disasters. And these duties are not currently being fulfilled in any adequate way. So today, I guess I just wanted to give brief answers to 3 questions, which have, I guess, already been touched on to some extent, but let me add the Law Centre's perspective. So first of all, how does climate change affect basic education? What are we doing as the Law Centre to address this, and what can other organisations do? And finally, what are the ways forward? So how does climate change affect basic education? Well, simply put, and as I think we're all aware, severe and frequent extreme weather events have put increasing pressure on South Africa's already failing and under-resourced schooling sector. So climate hazards can mean, in perhaps the worst case, that education just grinds to a halt completely. And this is especially true for schools in marginalized communities who are, as we know, disproportionately vulnerable to climate-related disruptions. As we've heard, South African coastal provinces have experienced an increase in the frequency and the severity of flooding, and its informal settlements largely situated in the low-lying areas that are worst hit. The floods in KwaZulu-Natal in 2022 that we've heard about today damaged 630 schools, with 124 schools suffering extensive damage up to a value of 400 million rand. Even where education can, in principle, continue in the face of extreme weather events, these kinds of climate hazards can severely impair the quality of education. So, as Matteo mentioned, extreme heat is a huge problem that we face in South Africa, especially for learners in mobile classrooms or other structures that are prone to overheating. So this seriously undermines the quality of education, creating intolerable learning environments and making it virtually impossible for learners to focus and actually get a benefit from their lessons. So altogether, these kind of disruptions have three sort of huge knock-on impacts. First of all, and perhaps most obviously, they set back learners' rights to basic education. Second of all, they increase the already existing inequalities in the schooling system. And third, they jeopardize larger efforts to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change. So on this last point, it's quite well accepted that education is key to ensuring environmental sustainability. Research shows a significant correlation between education levels and the capacity to adapt to and also reduce the risk of climate-related disasters, especially in under-resourced and marginalized communities. So clearly then there are super significant and profound connections between climate justice and education. The climate disasters will disrupt education, especially in marginalized communities. And at the same time, education is key to mitigating climate risks. So you end up with a vicious cycle. Climate disasters disrupt education, which undermine the ability to respond to climate disasters and make them more likely to happen again in the future. But despite this, and quite shockingly, education has largely been left off the climate agenda, both internationally and also domestically. So in terms of what we as an organization are doing to address this, last year, Katie Sutherland, together with one of our comrades at Equal Education, Stacey Jacobs, undertook a research project assessing South Africa's climate change plans, policies, and systems to see how do they take account of the impacts of climate risks on the schooling sector. And they assessed both national and provincial policies against three key priorities contained in the Comprehensive School Safety Framework. The three priorities were protection of the school community, educational continuity and minimization of disruptions, and the promotion of climate change education amongst both school communities and also key duty bearers. And our report contains a lot more detail, but it essentially concluded that these policies and plans really don't adequately capture any of the three priorities, and that major changes are needed to ensure that education is properly included on the climate justice agenda. So looking then at ways forward, there's an important legal development which I'm not sure has yet been mentioned, and that is the Climate Change Bill. So as of, I think it was the 25th of April this year, the bill was passed by both the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. As far as I'm aware, it has not yet received presidential assent, but I sincerely hope it does. And that's because the bill would require government departments, including the Department of Basic Education, to review and, if necessary, amend, coordinate and harmonize their various laws and policies and programs and decisions and even their decision-making processes to ensure that the risks of climate change and the associated vulnerabilities are properly taken into consideration. And not only that, there are also government departments listed in Schedule 2 of the bill, including the Department of Basic Education, who will be required to undertake these vulnerability assessments and to develop adaptation strategies and plans. So partly with this in mind, the Law Centre is currently undertaking a more detailed review of South Africa's infrastructure laws, not only in the education space, but also in the early childhood development space, which we think is equally important and equally liable to disruption by climate disasters. And this is with a view to making recommendations as to how they could be reformed to take better account of climate justice risks, and hopefully to feed into this process whereby the Department of Basic Education will be reviewing and adapting and amending all of their laws and policies across the board. For obvious reasons, we've focused on infrastructure, but it's important to note that it's all the laws and policies that will require review and harmonization. So that's one of the key things that we're doing, and one of the key ways forward, in our opinion. A second way forward is the handbook that we're developing on climate justice and education in South Africa. As I've mentioned, education is not currently front and center on the climate justice agenda as it ought to be. And so we're hoping that this handbook will help to more firmly establish the importance of education in the context of climate justice, and also to clarify state duties in this regard. And we have extended the window for making submissions to that handbook. So if anyone here is interested in contributing, we'd be incredibly grateful for your submissions. On top of that, we have plans to establish a regional climate justice and education coalition. And this is with the hope that different jurisdictions can learn from each other, and that we're not reinventing the wheel each time, but rather learning lessons from one another as to how to reform education laws and policies to ensure protection against climate-related risks. And you can look out for more information about that in the coming months. And finally, and I guess to pick up on this point about the crucial importance of budget, it's now something that we're planning to include in all our budget advocacy going forward. We think it's super important to make sure that there are sufficient resources to protect education from climate-related disruptions. Okay, thanks so much for listening to me. I hope that that sort of both signals the gravity of the issue and the urgency of putting education on the climate justice agenda, but at the same time offers some optimism, I guess, in terms of ways forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for an incredible presentation, and also for really highlighting the vicious cycles that schools as communities find themselves in. And also thank you for highlighting the amazing work that EELC is doing to ensuring that the education sector is front and center in terms of priority in the climate justice agenda. So thank you very much for that. If you've got questions for Tatiana, you can drop them in the chats, but then I'm going to introduce our next speaker. After all our speakers have spoken, then we will have an opportunity to engage with all our speakers. So thank you very much. I am going to move on to our next speaker, Celeste Madondo from WITS RHI. Celeste Madondo is an accomplished public health specialist who effectively manages a diverse portfolio comprising of multiple complex climate and health mitigation and adaptation interventions at WITS RHI. She oversees various transdisciplinary partners and consultants encompassing experts in meteorology, health, and data science. She provides leadership and influence and change policy at national and global levels. Thank you very much, Celeste, for making time for us. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. As alluded to by just the opening presenter, climate change is having a profound impact on global health. We know that it is well documented that climate change and extreme weather events are exacerbating health issues worldwide and putting strain on healthcare systems already stretched to the limit, especially in our region. Importantly, climate change will exacerbate global health inequities. This was already alluded to earlier, but the most vulnerable populations, including children, from infancy, women, youth, elderly, low-income groups, and hard-to-reach communities will be the most affected by climate-related consequences. I think the previous speakers already spoke to floods that occur and how hard-to-reach communities were even affected more. Regions such as Africa face heightened vulnerability to climate change impacts, exacerbated by our limited resources, our medical equipment, our inadequate infrastructure that Tatiana also touched on, both at a health care level as well as in the education system, and essential medical equipment. This further complicating our ability to address, to prepare, and to adapt to the environmental changes. This threat, of course, in Africa is further amplified, which Africa, in a sense, is also disproportionately affected by climate change, despite being responsible for only a small share of greenhouse gas emissions. This report that's being launched today highlights that climate change is beyond an education or health issue. It's far greater, and it also encompasses gender, social, economic, security, legal, and most importantly, it highlights climate change as a human rights issue. It forces us to look at climate change through a climate justice lens, but I would like to add that we also focus on it from an inequality lens. In South Africa, the impact of climate change varies geographically, necessitating differentiated approaches and responses across the country, of course, with vulnerable populations in mind. At Wits RHI, our studies focus on the effects of heat on healthcare workers, pregnant women, and infants in the Tshwane region. And from our systematic reviews that we've already conducted, we do find that extreme heat exposes our pregnant women and their children to effects or extreme effects, and this can lead to issues like preterm birth, low birth weight, and it of course poses risk of preeclampsia among pregnant women. So how can we respond, and what are some of the work that we are doing at Wits RHI to respond to this and to ensure that health systems, not only at Wits RHI and our contribution, but holistically, is more resilient? What I've done is I've just stratified it into three main components, and I'll start with the policy component. As research organizations, the research that we do should be robust and agile, and it should be able to inform policy. And as we know, that was already alluded to, policy implementation remains important. However, without the financing, we know that we can have beautiful policies. However, without it being financed, it can't be implemented. So climate financing remains an important element when we inform policy, but then the implementation thereof. We acknowledge that mitigation is an important element, but a far greater focus on need on vulnerable populations for adaptation remains key. There are already existing policies and guidelines that we should leverage on, and not to start from scratch, but to see how do we specifically leverage on existing policies that are effective, such as the school health policy, like ISHP. How do we leverage off such policies to further amplify the need of looking through or implementing using a climate justice lens? Of course, civil society participation in local governance and decision-making processes related to climate action is important for policy making, and this is more important to give children a voice at the table. And we need to advocate for policies and regulations that support climate resilience and sustainability at local, regional, and national levels. From a health system level, Mothe already touched on the WHO framework for building climate resilient health systems, and that we should look at this standpoint, these elements more holistically. What we are finding in one of our studies in Tshwane, we particularly focus on healthcare workers, their well-being. And given that healthcare workers, we specifically targeted this population, given that healthcare workers are pivotal in the implementation of programs in the health system, but also they play a bridging gap for the community at large. We are finding that the exposure to heat may impact their social as well as well-being and their ability to provide excellent quality of services. Therefore, our work is focused on ensuring that our healthcare workers are equipped, they are aware of what needs to be done, especially when they are faced with extreme heat specific events. We also emphasize that this psychosocial well-being is important. Therefore, appropriate psychosocial support services for healthcare workers is important and paramount, especially when we look at building resilient health systems, ensuring that our healthcare workers are prepared and are resilient for any changes that may occur. We also know that at the community and an individual level, the need for education and awareness is an important element for individuals to also be resilient on their own. We are emphasizing in one of our other studies the need for targeted early warning systems. This will prepare communities for extreme weather events and give them the necessary education on what they need to do if they are faced or when they are faced with extreme weather events, specifically heat. We encourage sustainable energy use and where feasible, invest in green infrastructure such as parks, non-reflective roofs, and urban forests to reduce urban heat islands that affect our healthcare. Our preliminary findings from our one study in Tshwane, which is conducted among pregnant women, reveals that the need for social cohesion is an important element for survival. Sometimes this is often forgotten, and some of the women highlighted the need for mutual support groups or mutual support networks, just a place where they can go when it's too hot in their informal settlement. Is there a space where a mutual group can go just for them to be able to cool off? Sometimes we take small things for granted, that somebody out there don't even have a space to cool off, not in their home. They can't open the door, it's still too hot. But what exists and what can we do from a community level to amplify social cohesion that is often left behind? Further to that, they also highlighted the lack of social cohesion is affecting to some extent this mental health, and mental health is being highlighted as a key component for communities to cope, and it's not emphasized enough, especially from childhood. And Chair, as I just reflect and as I want to conclude, I think that we require strategies that integrate climate resilience into existing health policies, promote sustainable practices, and enhance the capacity of health systems and our healthcare workers specifically to respond to evolving challenges posed by climate change. These discussions that we are having today extend beyond the narrow focus of healthcare and education specifically, but it emphasizes the need for an intersectoral response. Similar to what we've done in the years before us on HIV, climate change needs and requires a whole of government, whole of society approach to effectively prepare and respond to the effects of climate change, and of course putting children at the heart of this as they are our future, and it's our responsibility to protect our children. So with that, Chair, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Celeste, and also for highlighting the great work that BITS RHI is doing in the health space in relation to climate, particularly with the work that you've just highlighted on maternal and child health, or the effects of climate on maternal and child health, as well as mental health. So thank you so much for that presentation. And also you just said that the climate crisis requires an intersectoral response. And just looking at the comments, and there's different organizations here today. And so I'm just hoping that everybody present from the different sectors and different corners of society you occupy, you're seeing how you can incorporate the work of advocating for climate justice in your own space, or at least starting to think about it. So just agreeing with you on the point on intersectoral response. So we're just nearing the end. So we're just going to have our last speaker. And I'm just going to read her bio. She is unfortunately not present today, Mbali Baduza, because of the inauguration. She had to pull out, unfortunately, in the last minute, but also it's understandable because today is inauguration day. So I'm just going to read her bio quickly. And then if our tech team could just line up Mbali's video while I read her bio. Mbali Baduza is the Deputy Secretary of the Climate Justice Coalition in South Africa, Civil Society Commissioner at the Presidential Climate Commission, and the CEO of the Constitution Hill Trust. She was previously at Section 27. Pardon me. She was previously at Section 27. She was an activist lawyer who sought to help achieve substantive equality and social justice in South Africa. She coordinated the environmental and climate justice project here at Section 27, which explores and advances law and policy at the center that centers climate justice action in human rights discourse. So that is Mbali, who would have loved to be with us today, but she fortunately sent us a message. So Anissa, if you're ready, you can play Mbali's video.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you today for the launch of this important report by Section 27. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person or live, but it is Inauguration Day, and the chair of the Presidential Climate Commission is the president himself. So I hope you can understand my absence. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate Section 27 for putting together this timely report. Often these reports of this nature are technical and geared for an audience which has some know-how about the subject. And just like the Constitution and the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the days of yesteryear, climate literacy is low to non-existent in South Africa. While we feel the impacts and hear words like just transition and low carbon economies, it is difficult to link what we experience and what we know, or rather what we experience and what we don't know. This report is important because it does the work of educating people. And I might be biased, but it's educating the best kinds of people, you know, educating change makers, such as activists in the health and education sector, the people who are instrumental in having made democracy work for the past 30 years, and who I'm sure will be responsible to ensure that climate action in South Africa centers human rights, vulnerability, and leaves no one behind. So congratulations, Section 27, for again being the catalyst for social justice. I do want to quickly talk about the PCC and how civil society can get more involved in that work. So the PCC does a lot of work. We have consistent stakeholder engagement and consultations, working group meetings, commissioning a plethora of reports relevant to South Africa's just transition. While at the beginning, we predominantly focused on the energy transition, our work is expanding to include other sectors. A specific report that has relevance to health, education, and budget is the report we commissioned from Cambridge Econometric called The Impact of Trade and Climate Damage in South Africa's Economic Strategy. And the importance of the report is that it offers new insights into possible future economic challenges and opportunities arising from the climate crisis in South Africa. I won't spoil too much because I think it's important that every activist read these reports by the PCC to supplement their education as provided in reports such as those by Section 27. So a key point of the research is that it presents an analysis of South Africa's potential net zero pathways. It compares the future global context to South Africa, examining the interactions, and then incorporates the cost of expected climate damage. So it provides insights into how South Africa might respond to the expected future scenarios, associated trade-offs, and potential benefits. It is an absolutely groundbreaking report that I believe would give activists in the space, particularly in health and education, with advocacy tools to push for a fairer and more just transition while protecting one of the most vulnerable sectors, which is health and education. So, you know, what is always important is to recognize that the reports that the PCC commissions and releases speak to what policymakers are discussing as we speak and making decisions about. And, you know, what we're starting to see is that factors such as impacts on vulnerable people and sectors are acknowledged, right? But they are traded off without any proper constitutional balancing exercise. For example, recently, Eskom has decided to only start decommissioning 3 coal-fired power plants in Mpumalanga from 2030, while at the same time acknowledging rather casually that, you know, such a decision will have casualties in life and in health of people. It cannot be that such decisions remain unchallenged or not tested constitutionally. And where there are damage or damages, well, they should be paid. You know, civil society is quite familiar with these issues, and where the climate crisis is concerned, you know, it's not much different. There's always been trade-offs, and the loudest voices continue to dominate the discussion and the decision-making processes. So in essence, what the PCC reports do is that they provide tools of advocacy points based on sophisticated modeling, which are up to date with the latest science, but also are a product of thorough consultation with various sectors in society. So to conclude, I have so much to say, but let me stop. To conclude, there are various opportunities to engage with the PCC and to enrich the advocacy of activists in health and education and in budget. You know, the first is to attend the PCC Watch meetings that is held by civil society commissioners every quarter ahead of the quarterly meetings of the PCC. This is an opportunity for commissioners to go into depth about its work, but also get informed by civil society on issues they wish for us to take up. So it is an important space that I encourage you to take advantage of. The second thing before I go is every 5 years, countries to the Paris Agreement have to submit nationally determined contributions, and those are due early next year. So the PCC this year will be running consultations, thorough consultations throughout the country about what our NDCs should say. And I strongly encourage civil society to attend these consultations in numbers. Bring these arguments that appear in the Section 27 report and that you're experiencing on the ground. Get together, prepare, and attend with a solid narrative to influence the ambitions of the NDCs. The louder your voices, the more they'll hear you. And of course, we will continue to push the voices of civil society in the spaces we find ourselves as commissioners. So please do invite us to your webinars, your talks, and we'll be happy to come. I'll leave it there. Thank you, and well done, Section 27, for this great report. I'll be sharing it with the Adaptation Resilience Working Group in August. Thanks.
All right, and that was our last speaker for the day, Mbali Paduza. And it's also just really great to have her on the panel and also to hear how we as civil society can interact with the PCC. Like she reiterated more than once, the louder our voice is and the more unified our voice is, the more chances we have of influencing policy in the direction that serves the communities that we represent. So it's really not only just about our individual work or the work that we do individually, but we must as a sector, be able to find commonality and speak with one voice. So that was Mbali Paduza. And so I think I'm going to move on to Q&A. And I'll just I'm just going to go to the chats quickly. I saw a question, I think, about finance. Leslie saying the question we need to ask ourselves is where will the money come from if this is classified as a right that everybody can claim, and we're already facing backlogs that were not executed within the timeframes. Interesting talk, and I appreciate the invitation. My best wishes, and may our young ones stand together on this life-threatening reality. And so perhaps at CD, maybe you might just jump in on, where does the money come from? It's good and well to say that we want more money, but perhaps you could, give us a bit more insight or your thoughts really about the, possible avenues or places where, we can get the money.
Sure, thank you. And thanks, Leslie, for the question. It is almost like not the $1 million question, but it is something that is constantly engaged about in the budget space and the financing space. Like, how do we structure or best position our fiscal policy to advance human rights? Like, how do we do it? Because there are all these rights in the Constitution, but then there's like finite resources, right? And so it is an important question. And I would also recommend the work of the IEJ, the Institute for Economic Justice, the AIDC, and the Parliamentary Budget Office. They do lots of like really good work on fiscal expansion. So how do we, get more money to fund even like existing obligations, but also, you could expand that and transfer some of that to the climate financing, which is really important. And then also we have seen that these revenue raising, it can sometimes be quite a controversial topic because of the way that how the state funds these things has implications on most people, either through taxes, through loans, through budgets, budget cuts. But we have seen, civil society win in those ways and show government and engage with Treasury that there are alternatives beyond the status quo of like, okay, our economy is looking bad, or we have this crisis, there's nothing we can do. We've seen that, for example, with the Jafekra and the gold fund that Treasury had. It was through advocacy by civil society in through civil society's work and organizations that I've mentioned, who've been able to put that on the table, and that's been taken on. And what that has meant is that, yes, we're still in a context where there are budget cuts and we're not allocating enough resources as we are because of our constrained economic climate, but we could cushion that burden or that hardship for most people in the country. And one of the ways, and that's to be strategic and use all our tools to achieve that. Another way is just, that gender responsive budgeting, which is also something that came from civil society, like ongoing efforts since the 90s, and it's coming to fruition. Then we should also be thinking about not just where the new money is coming from, but also recognizing that as a country, we already spend so much money on human rights in that way. And how we get that money is through loans, through debt and the bond market, through taxing and how we tax people in the country, consumption tax, income taxes. And then, of course, like, we have to look at the expenditure side. And while, the report doesn't explicitly say, we don't explicitly hold a position that, okay, we need to take out a loan or whatever, but whether it's the JET IP, the $8.5 billion that's coming in, or the money that we're already spending, the 260 billion we're already spending on healthcare, the 300 billion that we're spending on education, it's just about, like, how do we redirect that in a way that foregrounds this consideration, the climate change, like, how do we become climate responsive to that, so that we can allocate the funding that we already have and the resources we already have to protecting the most marginalized people. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. It is like we could have a whole webinar about where the money comes from and whether it's okay, and the politics behind that, the political economy. But that's a starting point, I think, for civil societies thinking about it.
Thank you, Tsidi. Thank you so much for that comprehensive response, and also giving us just some nuggets to think about in engaging with the conversation of where does the money come from. We are chasing time, so I think I'm just going to read maybe one or two comments if I can find them. Andrew says, I'll be glad if the committee on this report can share with us outside of SA, please. It's also good that we want to learn from it, as well as we think creating space for such as well. Thank you very much, Andrew. I think if you check the comments, the link has been provided, but if the Section 27 team can just, perhaps, Andrew, you joined afterwards, or for anybody who might have joined afterwards, please reshare the report. It's now available on our website. And I think because of time, let me just check, do we have questions? Are there people who would like to ask questions outside of the comments in the chat box? If you've got a question, you can raise your hand. If not, I think, just one question I was just thinking, that for the speakers, really, if the organizations in health education, or maybe in other sectors, if people have joined us today, who are thinking, we want to engage in the work of advocating for climate justice, but not quite sure where to start, and so perhaps in your closing remarks, you could also just give an idea to organizations who want to, start, or, either strengthen or start the work of advocating for climate justice for the communities that they represent, whether they're in health, education, or other. But at this moment, I'll just allow speakers to make closing remarks for about a minute, I think. I'll start maybe from the bottom up again. So Celeste, if you're ready with your closing remarks, and then after Celeste, Tatiana, you can just go for it as well.
So thank you, Chair. I can see we're running out of time, but just to congratulate Section 27 on the launch of this report. Climate justice is, of course, an important element that, as we are embarking on our work, be it from a research perspective, we should always put communities, especially vulnerable communities, at the forefront of the work that we do. We are planning co-design workshops, and I'm hoping that as part of the co-design workshops, as it informs our adaptation interventions, it can use a climate justice lens and an equality lens for effective programming and implementation. So thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you very much for neatly keeping it at 60 seconds or less. Tatiana, if you're ready with your closing remarks.
Yeah, it's really just to say thank you so much to Section 27 for convening us. I think collaboration on the issue of climate justice is absolutely key, and that those of us working in education or health or different sectors have a lot to learn from one another. But equally, you know, the lawyers and the economists and the budget analysts and the policy experts and those with lived experience, I think we all must come together to co-create solutions. And when Section 27 creates spaces like this, it gives us an opportunity to do that. So thank you very much, and I hope to see everyone in this room again in the near future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tatiana. Matshidiso?
Yeah, I think I got really lucky because I got to answer a question. So that also captured the closing remarks. But just to say, just to encourage, I'm very happy to see the engagement already regarding the report, and just to encourage other organizations and individuals to also share the work that we're doing so that we can continue to strengthen our sector and the work that we are already doing in advancing the realization of all these constitutionally protected rights in this ongoing climate context.
Thank you so much, Matshidiso. And lastly, but certainly not least, Mateo Brody, you get our final word.
Thank you, Pearl. Largely covered. Thank you to everyone that has joined for this conversation. I think it's been really a great conversation where we've all been learning from each other, as Tatiana has been saying. I think to answer the question that you posed, Pearl, I will just say that we are going to be, the work doesn't stop. We're going to still be engaging with various decision makers, Department of Health, Education, Treasury, moving forward. And I think we, you know, as Mbali was saying, the more united a voice we have, the more change we can affect. So I would encourage people on the call to really follow us on our social media, reach out to us, and there's always space for collaboration. The last thing is also I'll always plug the Climate Justice Coalition that we're a member of. Organizations or people that are interested in working on climate justice and advancing climate justice should definitely consider joining the Climate Justice Coalition, which is made up of a variety of organizations from different sectors and different parts of the province. But thank you also again, Pearl, and our comms team.
Thank you, Mateo, and thank you really from myself and the team at Section 27 to all our speakers who availed themselves, today, and to everybody who, was able to join. Everybody's still with us, and some people did note that they had to attend to other engagements, but we absolutely appreciate your participation. I think the link to this recording will be made available. I'll have to double check with my team. And so if you've registered, I think we will send out the recording. And also to journalists as well who have attended and would like to cover the story, ask follow-up questions. I've put my email in the chat, nicodemus@section27.org.za. And thank you, everybody. I'll keep the chat running just in case there's some information that you're looking to get. But thank you for attending. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon.